This selection describes how it happened that I decided to quit my job and go camping for a year. I have busted out, broken loose from the oppression of my job as a drudge in the Advanced Planning Division, City of Santa Maria, California. After struggling with the pros and cons of quitting my job at the brink of middle age, the ayes and the nays finally settled into place, heavily on the side of the ayes. And it was clear that spending the rest of my working life as a city planner would be a sellout. Even though I was in my late 30s, even though my inbred sense of responsibility argued for bucking up and settling down, I could not endure that fate. The wisdom of too many philosophers, dreamers, and social advisors resounded in my head. Follow your dream. Live life to the fullest. March to the beat of your own drummer, etc. In Santa Maria, every morning was the same. I would arrive at work early before the others, pour a cup of coffee, and sit down at my desk, staring at the pages of rough draft and outlines in front of me. I was responsible for writing elements of the general plan, which I did with my best technical writing skills, although little did it matter, as these documents were given only minimally prescribed attention before being rubber stamped by the City Council and shelved in the city archives along with all the other yellowing general plan documents. Alone in the office, in the silent office, I began my customary pre-work daydream with a question. What would I rather be doing right now besides sitting at this cold desk in this dank, windowless office? I would close my eyes and look inward as though lying on an analyst's couch, trying to visualize myself in my idyllic spot. The materializing image was a solitary campsite along a murmuring stream. It is morning, and I am sitting in my camp chair on a little sandy bar with a cup of coffee in my hand, gazing at the sparkling waters, sunlight warming my skin. I hear the morning titter of songbirds. A forest of fir and pine forms a backdrop. I performed this exercise daily, closing my eyes and concentrating. Each time, images flashed through my mind like pages in a cartoon flip book, and each time the flickering images settled back onto the streamside camp. No doubt about it, I would rather be camping at this very moment. Camping, however, is not a viable, lifelong pursuit. It can last a week, 2 maybe, depending on weather, bugs, boredom, and things like that. Still, what if I could just take off and go wherever I wanted to? For as long as I wanted, traveling around, visiting national parks, cruising back roads, exploring campgrounds, and stopping for the night wherever I pleased. Imagine doing that for, say, a year. Sometimes an idea delivers a lightning bolt punch. This one did, a sudden blitz of an idea. Why not, just for the sheer amusement factor of it, try to figure out what it would cost to finance a year-long camping trip, just for the of it. I grabbed a pencil and a blank sheet of paper and began scribbling, and this is what you can't see, but I've got 2 little feasibility studies. Year-long camping trip feasibility study. Vehicle, used camper, $2,500 to $3,500. Per month for a whole year, $5,000. Equipment and gear, $500. And because I was a very responsible person, Post-trip reserve, $3,000. Total, $11,000 to $12,000. As I added the last digit, I gaped in disbelief at the bottom line. Surely it must be wrong. I had expected some exorbitant, unattainable figure like $30,000, $40,000, which for me might as well have been $1 million. But $11,000 or $12,000 was not so much. A person could raise that amount of money, but how quickly, I wondered. Could I raise that amount in, say, a year? I grabbed more paper and started figuring again. Year-long camping trip, feasibility study, estimated savings for 1 year, half of city planning paycheck, $6,300. Part-time college teaching, 2 semesters, $3,500. Sell Dodge Colt, $1,200. Total, $11,000. My mouth dropped open when I saw the bottom line, so eerily matching my estimated expenses as though fudged by an obliging fairy god accountant. These morning scribblings had been strictly for amusement. They weren't supposed to line up like this, but there it was, the budget, staring at me from yellow-lined paper, shouting, "Feasible, feasible." I should have been exhilarated, but instead I was struck with a profound fear. I couldn't just quit my job and drive away. At my age, it would be grossly irresponsible, too wild, too reckless, wouldn't it? I grasped desperately for the cons against such a crazy idea. Surely there must be some blaring reason why it was not possible. But there wasn't. My heart thumped loudly in my throat. My breathing came shallow and perforated like strained wind. I looked up from my desk at the bare, brown wall in front of me. The words seemed to come of their own accord from some submerged font of confidence in me. I am going to do it. And then I did take to the road for a year, and this next piece is a description of a harrowing experience I had in South Carolina at a place called Dreher Island State Recreation Area. For the first time in months, I stripped off my sweatshirt and slid into a short-sleeved t-shirt, kicked off my shoes and socks, and wriggled into sandals. With a cold beer in hand, I slumped into my camp chair to soak up the 80-degree warmth. Later, I changed into my running shorts and shoes and set off down the road, leading away from the campground, relishing the idea of a good, long, sweaty run to exorcise the unpleasant residua from the last 2 days of anguished driving. As always, when I ran in unfamiliar places, I kept a watchful eye for anything that might pose a threat. Traffic speeding around blind corners, unsavory characters, and especially dogs on the loose. I had been chased and bitten by dogs before. But this bucolic setting seemed to present no problems as I ran by groves of trees and occasional farmhouses. Ahead of me, a long, high hedge paralleled the road, separating it from a large house atop a knoll. A sweeping lawn fanned upward from the hedge to the house. Wary of what might be hidden behind the barrier, I skirted widely away to the opposite side of the road, keeping a sharp lookout until I left it behind me. I continued on through open country for another mile, then turned back toward the campground, running easily and dropping my guard, knowing the way was clear. Ahead of me, I saw the dark green hedge again, but I would not have to avoid it now. I cruised along at a good clip, almost brushing the hedge as I ran. Just as I cleared the last shrub, I heard it, growling. Not low, warning growls, but growls of killer intent. I jerked to a halt and looked up. 2 black Doberman pinschers were charging full speed downhill at me, and I knew I was going to be attacked. In the heart-stopping second before they reached me, I listened for a command from an owner, "Bad boy, stop!" But it didn't come. I was helpless, and I couldn't outrun the dogs. There was no one around, and running would only make them more savage. They were almost on me when I turned to face them. Yeah, it was heart-stopping. My second book is called Vagabonda, Solo Camper Out West, and it's a collection of more camping adventures. I was a solo camper for 30 years of my life. Excuse me. And so this is a book that covers 15 years of solo camping. This selection describes another harrowing incident I had in 1984 when I was on my way from Fresno, California to the White Mountains on the border of California and Nevada. And I wanted to stop over at a campground somewhere about halfway. So this is the story about what happened. North of Indian Wells, Highway 14 joined US Highway 395. Soon after passing this junction, I came to a small road sign, Kennedy Meadows Campground. An arrow pointed west. I looked in the direction of the arrow and could not believe my eyes. The road was nothing more than a scratch on the sheer face of the rock. I could see the trace of it going up the barren mountainside, a mere etching on the yellow-gray canyon wall, rising higher and higher, steep and perilous. No vehicle could ascend that grade. No one would dare. This can't be the road, I thought. Maybe I hadn't come far enough. Maybe the sign meant in a quarter mile, like most campground indicating signs. I pulled over and rechecked my maps, but no other roads appeared anywhere nearby. This had to be the right road. If there was a campground up there, people must drive it, I reasoned. Maybe what I was seeing wasn't the real deal. Maybe the true Kennedy Meadows Road was paved and smooth, but hidden behind the canyon walls. I turned left across the highway and started up the road. The first 9 miles were aptly named 9 Mile Canyon Road. It ran ruler straight as it traversed the coalescing alluvial fans at the base of the mountains. But when it reached the canyon's entrance, it quickly crept up on the canyon wall, fitting itself to the rocky face like a strip of adhesive tape. Now I could see that this indeed was the fearsome road I had seen from below the highway, but I pressed on. After a few miles, the pavement ended and became dirt. The grade steepened and rose precipitously up on the canyon's steep side. It seemed to narrow and pinch out in the distant sky, with no guardrails to provide even a semblance of safety from a sheer drop-off. Worry began to gnaw at my stomach, but I inched forward, suspended high on the thin roadbed gouged out of naked rock. Clutching the wheel, I could hear gravel clattering beneath me as my tires grabbed for traction. A rooster tail of dust rose like smoke behind me. The road zigged into a side canyon and folded back on itself in a hairpin curve. Coming through the turn, I glanced out my side window and nearly fainted. The edge of the road seemed to have disappeared, and all I could see was sky. My foot sprang to the brake, and I came to a stop as a wave of fear and nausea swept over me. Paralyzed with terror, I could not go on, and I could not turn around. I was stranded. I turned off the engine and tried to calm myself. I had to get out of there. But how? Going forward was not an option. I set the handbrake, got out, and walked back down the road, reeling, trying not to look over the brink, desperately seeking a wide place where I could maneuver. But the road was too narrow, too dangerous for turning around. I knew I couldn't do it. My stomach clutched at the mere thought of attempting it, but then the hideous reality struck. I had to. There was no other choice. The only remotely possible place to turn around, it seemed, was about 50 yards back at the side canyon. With my left hand on the steering wheel, and I returned to the car, started the engine, and shifted into reverse. With my left hand on the steering wheel and my right arm on the back of the passenger seat, I craned my neck over my right shoulder and began backing up, slowly, slowly, inches at a time, gripped the entire way by a sickening image of my rear wheels slipping over the edge and the sound of the desperate revving of my engine trying to regain the road, and then the tumbling end over end into nothingness. Every few feet I stopped, got out, and checked my nearness to the edge. At last, I reached the apex of the bend. I got out to assess my backup leeway about 2 feet to the inside edge of the road at the canyon wall. Back in the car, I cranked the steering wheel hard and backed up no more than a few inches. I got out and checked. 1 more foot. I backed up again until my rear wheels touched the edge of the road and my bumper grazed rock. Back in the car, I cranked the steering wheel in the other direction as far as it would go and inched forward, gulping hard at the sight of the cliff edge in front of me. I repeated the process again and again, back and forth, a few inches at a time, until, at last, the nose of my car pointed down slope. And this is my non-camping book, Eugeniana, Memoir of an Oregon Hometown. This covers my growing up years, stories from my growing up years, which was from the mid-1940s until the late 60s, very early 70s. And the piece that I would like to read to you is called Tap Dancing at Washington Park, and it tells what happened when my sister Susan and I took tap dancing lessons there in the early 50s. Susan and I were born dancers. All us girls were, swinging and pirouetting around the house anytime someone put a record on the phonograph. But Susan and me, we could cut a rug. We had our specialty dances, the shag and the swing, and we practiced them to perfection. 1, 2, quick step. We did a pretty good imitation of ballet, too. But what we couldn't fake without making kicking, flailing fools of ourselves was tap dancing. For tap dancing, we needed lessons. Off to Mom we went. "If you're serious about sticking with it, I'll sign you up," she said. We bobbled our heads up and down and promised. Lessons were held in the new community building at Washington Park. On the first day, we walked all the way from 8th and Monroe to 19th and Washington to the lovely neighborhood park there. 2 large maple trees stood in front of the community building. Inside, anxious little girls and their mothers lined the walls and waited for instructions. Susan and I, on our own, stood apart, awkward, not knowing what we were supposed to do and wondering if moms were required. But soon all was sorted out, and the instructor, Irene Albino, had us aspiring dancers lined up in rows. She began with the basics. First, we learned to shuffle, a quick forward scrape with the ball of our foot against the floor and back. We practiced over and over, the concrete floor ringing with the clatter of metal taps. When we had mastered the shuffle, Mrs. Albino added the next step, called step. Step with the left foot, shuffle with the right. Then step with the right foot and shuffle with the left, over and over. It was a piece of cake for Susan and me. We picked it up quickly. And when Mrs. Albino added the third step, ball change, we picked that up easily too. By the end of the second lesson, we were doing an entire dance routine to sidewalks of New York, practicing at home and performing for Mom and Dad. All was going well, but that was soon to change. On the second or third lesson, Mrs. Albino took us through our warm-ups and routines, then mysteriously ended the lesson early. She and an assistant began hauling out thick blue tumbling mats. Without any explanation as to why, she instructed us to line up at one end of the mats to do somersaults. I was a sissy about anything to do with throwing my body to the ground, and I did not like where this was leading. What did somersaults have to do with dancing anyway? I was worried about what Mrs. Albino had in mind next. Sure enough, after a few rounds of somersaults, Mrs. Albino told us that on the next round, we were going to do cartwheels. Terror ripped through me as I stood in line, watching all the girls before me execute nearly perfect cartwheels. I had absolutely no idea how to do a cartwheel, and every cell in my body railed against it. But I couldn't tell Mrs. Albino I didn't want to do it. She seemed to believe that all little girls inherently possessed the knack. Now I was standing at the foot of the mat. I knew I was about to make a laughing stock of myself, but there was no way out. "Go," Mrs. Albino said, in a quick, spasmodic move. I raised my arms high above my head, as I had seen the other girls do, but there was no impetus on earth that could make me hurtle my torso floorward. The best I could do was to bend at the waist and plant my hands on the floor, then rear end jutting, give a tiny kick outward, and do a kind of crab walk around my head. Red, hot shame colored my face even before I stood up. My utter humiliation and anger, too, outweighed any code of obedience my mother had instilled. I would never attempt another cartwheel in that class. Susan was sympathetic. She was not a tumbling sissy like me, but on one of her cartwheel attempts, she had landed hard and had the wind knocked out of her. After that, she wanted nothing more to do with tumbling. We had a dilemma. We didn't dare tell Mom we hated the tumbling and didn't want to go back. We had promised to stick it out. What were we to do? On the day of our next lesson, we walked full of trepidation to Washington Park. Girls and their moms were already inside. Susan and I hung back, fear striking deep. But if we hadn't been seen, maybe there was a way out. Quickly, we ducked behind the larger maple tree and cowered there as class began, shaken by the deed of disobedience we had just committed. Now we were faced with what to do next. Were we to hide behind the maple tree for the duration of the lesson, then casually walk home and lie to Mom? Today, in truth, neither Susan nor I remember what actually happened next. Did we swallow our shame and slink into class late? Did we stand pressed against the tree the entire time? Or did we troll through the neighborhood until we thought it safe to go home? It didn't matter. Mom found out, of course. And that was the end of our tap dancing lessons. But we have never forgotten them, the steps and the dance and the tumbling too. Washington Park looks the same today as it did in the early 1950s. The community building is still there, and the maple tree we hid behind still stands proudly in front. Whenever I happen to stroll up Washington Street, I sidestep up to the window of our old tap dance venue and peek through the concrete floor. I imagine little girls wearing shiny tap dance shoes, and it all comes back. East side, west side, all around the town. Step, shuffle, ball change. Step, shuffle, ball change.
That was delightful. Did the dogs ever get you, or do we have to buy the book?
You have to buy
We have to buy the book, okay. Wow. Love those. You know, we all love a story, don't we? So, while I adjust this, another round of applause for Lynn Ash. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Lynn. That was a lot of fun.